Welcome to Season 2 of News Take. I'm Rebecca Frank, Vice President of Research and Insights at the News Media Alliance. For those of you who haven't joined us before, News Take is an opportunity for the people who are changing and shaping the future of the publishing industry to share their thoughts and perspectives. As we move into 2023, it's clear that the pace of change in the ever-evolving landscape of news and information isn't slowing down at all, and the need for trusted publishers to cut through the clamor and help people live informed and healthy lives is greater than ever, which is where I hope today's guest can really provide some insight and food for thought. Gordon Crovitz is co-founder and co-CEO of NewsGuard, which counters misinformation online through what they call their nutrition labels for news and information websites. Gordon was previously publisher of the Wall Street Journal, where he was also the rule of law and information age columnist. He spent nearly 30 years at Dow Jones and the Journal. Prior to that, he was CEO of learning company Houghton Mifflin Harcourt and was co-founder of a subscription revenue tech company, Press Plus. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Rebecca, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So first, I want to ask you about your path to this point in your career. Obviously, you've had an incredible run as a journalist. What made you shift gears to help start NewsGuard?
The problem that my co-founder, Steve Brill, who also is a journalist, founded American Lawyer and Court TV, the problem that we observed back in 2018 when we started the company was that the internet had the great characteristic of allowing everybody to be a publisher. Mm-hmm. But that was also the worst thing about it. Everybody could become a publisher. And from the point of view of news consumer, that meant it had become virtually impossible for people to tell the difference between a generally reliable source in their Facebook feed or in a search result and a generally trustworthy site versus an untrustworthy site. And so that was our original observation. Wouldn't it be great if we could help news consumers differentiate this constant stream of news and information that we're getting increasingly through social media platforms and otherwise indirectly? For some members of your audience, they may remember the pre-internet era. Somebody might go to a newsstand and say, I'd like a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm not interested in National Enquirer. And people would know the difference. And that's really not true anymore. It's very difficult for regular news consumers to tell the difference. So that was our original idea, that the best way to counter misinformation, false narratives, is to empower consumers with the tools they need to understand which brands are trustworthy and which are not.
Do you think that insight, the need and the desire and the way that NewsGuard could add value, do you think it required a journalist's perspective to bring that to bear?
We like to say that it may be a technology problem, but it has a journalistic solution. I think looking at it from the point of view of users, which is how journalists, go through life, we're looking for viewers or readers or subscribers. The world really did change with the internet, and particularly with social media, where people were not going to the homepage of even the Wall Street Journal, I regret to say. They were getting their news indirectly, say through a Facebook feed, and now increasingly through so many other social media outlets. It's also impossible for a machine, for artificial intelligence, to differentiate a trustworthy site from an untrustworthy site. The website for the American Cancer Society, for example, highly trustworthy, looks exactly like lookalike websites pretending to be reliable sources of news that will sell people a subscription to peach pits to cure cancer. The incentive for malign actors on the internet is tremendous. One of the things that we learned to our surprise is the extraordinarily high percentage of popular news sources that are untrustworthy. Yeah. So our system is we identified 9 basic criteria of journalistic practice. apolitical criteria like, is there a corrections policy? Can you tell who owns the site? Does it separate news and opinion? Those sorts of criteria. And we've applied those to all the news and information sources that account for 95% of engagement online. And we serve audiences in the US, Canada, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Austria, and we just launched in Australia and New Zealand. And that's, a large number of news and information sources. Of all the sources that we've rated, 40% of them are rated as untrustworthy. So the biggest category is healthcare hoax sites. Mm-hmm. Tremendous number of them before COVID, and then especially during COVID.
Yeah.
But also, many disinformation sites from hostile foreign governments, Russia, China, Iran, and other bad actors focused on politics and other topics. So the extraordinarily high percentage of untrustworthy sources was a big surprise.
Yeah.
And we do think that it takes journalists to solve this problem in the sense that to give consumers information that they trust about the sources of news they see, they need to trust the raters. So we operate with radical transparency about the criteria. We always call for comment. Mm-hmm. For any website that looks like it's going to fail any of our criteria. Algorithms, of course, don't call for comment.
Not usually, no.
No, even with ChatGPT, we don't think it's going to change things in this regard. Yeah. So it takes humans, and there's a lot of research from independent parties, including academics, that when they see our ratings, which are from a diverse set of journalists using apolitical criteria, they appreciate having the context about the nature of news publishers. They don't trust technology companies to do that. They don't trust machines to do it. But they are willing to be instructed with information about the nature of websites by journalists about other journalists.
Yeah. So you started already giving us some details about the product itself, but the nutrition label product, let's start there. Who is using that product? Is it the average consumer? Is it educators? How are people folding it into their lives or their work?
Right. So our ambition, of course, is that everybody should have access to the ratings, no matter where they're getting their news and information online. One of our partners is Microsoft. Microsoft makes our ratings available to all of the users of its Edge browser, free of charge to the user. It also has incorporated our ratings into some of its platforms and products.
Wow.
We hope that the other platforms will follow suit: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. Our ratings are available to about 20 million public school students.
Wow.
Through a relationship we have with the American Federation of Teachers, and then other programs directly with schools and universities and other intermediaries. We have what we call a B2B2C strategy.
Okay.
We license our data, for example, to Microsoft, and Microsoft then makes it available to its users.
And that data includes, if an average consumer is going about the web and they find a source and there's some sort of interaction, something that happens, they're introduced to the nutrition label, and it describes, as you mentioned, the transparency, how it works, what it is, why it's being rated that way.
Exactly. So for your listeners and viewers, if they are using the Edge browser, they can go to the browser extension store, download NewsGuard, and at that point, they'll see ratings alongside news and information sources, whether it's in a search result or in their social media feed. Pretty much wherever they're seeing news and information, they'll see a point score. And if they hover over that, they'll get our top line assessment of the site. And then if they want the full nutrition label, as we call our full rating, then that is available. And that includes a detailed explanation of how the site did based on the 9 criteria, includes citations, includes comments from the publisher. Some of those are thousands of words long. Some of them are shorter, depending on the complexity of the website, and those are all updated throughout the year.
I think that's really great, and I think the idea of, you know, keeping that information, just making it all public, you know, telling people someone's looked at this, someone's investigated this, you know, you can continue to read it if you want, but here's what you should know.
Exactly. So it doesn't censor anything. It simply gives consumers more information. Libraries actually were the first to embrace NewsGuard at the very beginning. We're now available at 800 public libraries around the world, where our browser extension's been downloaded on the computers that library patrons use. So librarians tell us that this, is a good supplement to their work, which is to help people find different sources. It's not to block anything or to censor anything. And the fact that we're doing all the news and information sources that account for 95% of engagement means, all the members of the News Media Alliance, of course, would be included, but we get down to bloggers and very small sites serving specialist communities.
And the smaller sites are graded on the same criteria as the larger sites. There's not a differential between them.
Exactly. And, for a new digital startup run by, experienced journalists, that can have the same rating as the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal.
Very interesting. So I want to shift and talk a little bit, my background is in advertising. I want to talk about the BrandGuard product, which it seems is more for advertisers on the other side of the equation, right? This other piece of misinformation is, of course, that due to programmatic online advertising, a lot of advertising dollars are propping up sites that aren't real information. Can you talk about BrandGuard some?
Absolutely. Thank you. That's the other main leg of our business. You said earlier, you described our work very well, where you said, somebody at least has looked at this website, assessed it based on basic criteria of journalistic practice. That's the role that we play for the advertising community. I think people are generally aware that a large percentage of advertising these days is digital, about 3/4 of advertising these days is digital, and of that, most of it is programmatic. So, in other words, more than a quarter of all the advertising is placed automatically through algorithm. And those algorithms will place ads on whatever website the algorithm determines is the optimal one, regardless of the quality of that website. That's been the nature of programmatic advertising really from the beginning. It's now a quite significant issue because such a high percentage of advertising is programmatic. And there are two problems.
Yeah.
One is that working with ComScore, we estimated that there's $2.6 billion a year going to misinformation websites unintentionally.
That's billion with a B.
That's billion with a B, 2.6 billion. And we have found more than 1,000 blue chip brands, name the brand, with ads on Russian disinformation sites, healthcare hoax sites, stop the steal sites, COVID denying sites, crazy sites. Many of them, their only source of revenue is programmatic advertising unintentionally placed on their websites. So I'll give you an example. Not too long ago, you may recall there was a personal attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of Nancy Pelosi. And a website called the Santa Monica Observer published a story claiming that Paul Pelosi was attacked by a gay prostitute. Completely false story. That story was then retweeted and shared and got a tremendous amount of traffic. And to this day, months later, it carries advertising from every name brand that you can think of. And so you have a situation where Hertz and Avis and United, name a brand, will see their ads on that website because it's being placed there programmatically, even though the story is completely untrue and it's not the kind of website that any corporate executive wants to be associated with.
Right.
The challenge is, and you may ask, well, why hasn't that stopped?
Mm-hmm.
Very logical question. One answer, of course, is that until relatively recently, there wasn't a source for advertisers or brands or ad agencies to use. There are brand safety companies with names like Double Verify and IAS,
Mm-hmm.
very good at keeping ads off of pornography sites, for example. But they do that with artificial intelligence, with machines, and a machine can't tell the difference between the Santa Monica Observer
Right.
and the San Francisco Chronicle. So we now license the same ratings that we make available to news consumers are now being used by advertisers, ad agencies, ad tech companies to separate out, is this the sort of website where we'd like our ads to appear, or is it not? And if not, our exclusion list
Mm-hmm.
is activated at different points in the somewhat complicated programmatic advertising ecosystem.
Right. That was going to be my next question, right? You've built a useful tool, but you're fighting a system that is very opaque at best, right?
It's opaque at best, and when we tell company CEOs and CMOs that their ads are supporting terrible websites, almost always the first reaction of the CEO is that can't be true. And the CEO will then look to the CMO and say, is that true? And the CMO will then say, well, we don't really know. And then we've seen time and again the CEO literally say, don't you look at all the websites where our ads are running? And of course, the CMO is thinking to himself or herself, are you kidding? We're on thousands of websites. I have no idea where we run. I have no idea. How would I know? And that's the problem. So the CMO has to say to the CEO, that is not where we want our ads to run. There are solutions in the market that we can use. NewsGuard has relationships now with several of the big ad agency holding companies, IPG, Publicis, among them. And
Sure.
we're working with quite a number of the supply side platforms which help sort of curate where ads will appear. But I would say we're protecting a tiny percentage of the programmatic advertising, which is why there's $2.6 billion going to these terrible websites. And again, it's unintentional.
I want to go from there a little bit to a slightly different question. We're hearing as now, to put a timestamp at the start of 2023, a lot of concerns that advertisers will be cutting their budgets with, economic conditions predicted to not look so good in the mid to, short to mid term. How do you think that these products, the NewsGuard products, could help publishers weather an economic downturn?
Yeah. Well, there are two things. One is we encourage highly rated publishers to promote their high ratings to advertisers and to remind advertisers that they have a choice. Will they support high quality journalism or will they subsidize misinformation?
Right.
Part of that argument should be an economic one, which is we now have case studies that make clear that advertising on high quality news sites is much more cost effective for advertisers than advertising on crazy misinformation sites. So we've got case studies that show that the average CPM is actually less on a high quality site and engagement is much higher.
And that's because those tend to maybe be more real people and less bots.
They tend to be more real people and more real people who actually might buy something and who appreciate the news environment and all the arguments that legitimate news publishers use. But it stands to reason if your ad is running on RT or Sputnik or some other Russian disinformation site, that is probably not the environment where you want to rent your car or, look for people.
Probably not, no.
So it's an argument that publishers can use with advertisers. They save money by directing their programmatic advertising it to legitimate publishers, not misinformation publishers. And the other part of what we do is, in addition to the exclusion list, we have inclusion lists where we've identified thousands of high quality sites that are rarely on anybody's programmatic advertising buying list. So these may be early stage, high quality news startups. That would include a large number of news sites serving the Black community, Hispanic community, Asian community, LGBTQ plus communities, where there are many high quality news sites that typically get very little or no programmatic advertising because they're not on a list to be used. So we encourage advertisers to use both our exclusion list to keep their ads brand safe, away from misinformation, and our inclusion list where they're able to support high quality journalism and reach an attractive audience.
And you mentioned, some of the sites that don't make it onto buys. Those are sites, serving minority audiences of all types. And I realized I didn't ask, does your team have the capability to look at sites that are not in English at present?
Oh, yes. We operate in all the local languages.
Okay.
So we're serving France with French, Germany with German. And we also monitor disinformation sources in languages like Russian and Chinese.
I want to talk a little bit more about ad tech, and then I want to come back to that. So, we mentioned the opaque ad tech marketplace. I think many of the publishers that I'm talking to, they say we're stuck in this system, and there's not much, we can do. We don't have the relationships directly with advertisers anymore. What's the role, you mentioned agencies and holding companies. What's their role as consultants and advisors to advertisers, and how are you working with them?
Yeah. So at the largest holding companies, there are executives whose responsibility include brand safety. So, they are executives who have been tasked with trying to solve this problem.
Right.
On behalf of their clients. And so that's, I think a potential ally for high quality publishers are the brand safety people at the advertising agency. But I want to just, modestly challenge what I'm sure you hear from news publishers, which is life is hard. It's no longer the case that news publishers have deep, direct relationships with advertisers. That's clearly true. And in a world of programmatic advertising, they may not even have much of a relationship with the agencies.
Yeah.
But not having the same relationship is not the same thing as not having any relationship. And I think the news publishers should be proud of the work that they do. They should highlight ratings from services like ours. They should remind advertisers that among the most popular sources of news and information, 40% of them are publishers of misinformation being funded to a large degree by blue chip advertisers.
Yeah.
So I don't think the publishers have to be passive.
Mm-hmm.
We have quite a number of publishers who cite their rating from us, reprint the nutrition label as part of their advertising marketing materials. That's great. We encourage publishers to do that. Just to be clear, of course, we don't charge publishers to get rated. We don't charge publishers for anything. But we do encourage them to cite their rating and to cite our case studies on the benefits of advertising on high quality news sources rather than having programmatic ads placed on misinformation sources.
Yeah, and that we at the Alliance have been working to convince publishers as well that there's a real important story. Not, the rating is one piece of it, and then there's that audience, right? The people who are seeing the rating, the people who are looking for that information to answer those questions. That's really interesting. So you mentioned the Russian language, and you mentioned a little bit Russian disinformation. I want to hear you talk about your misinformation fingerprints product, as I can imagine that product had quite a year in 2022.
Right. So we've talked about the ratings side of our business, so ratings for news publishers, how it's used by consumers and by advertisers for brand safety. We have another business that chiefly serves the defense and intelligence communities, which we call our misinformation fingerprints. That's a catalog of all of the top current hoaxes and misinformation spreading on all of the platforms. It includes a narrative, an explanation of the false claim, a debunking of the false claim, multiple examples of it, hashtags, Boolean search terms, to enable our licensees to take a false narrative and, using their own machine learning tools, find the provenance, find all examples that concern them. We also work with some social media companies that are looking for false narratives that may be on their platforms in order to mitigate them. One use case that we hope to see actually is with the new ChatGPT and similar services, whereas the machines are trained essentially on the open internet. And that means, yikes is the right word. And then what that means is if you ask the ChatGPT now to replicate a false narrative in the news, it will do that in almost every case. We've tried it, and in about 80% of the cases, it's happy to repeat the false claim. So, we hope that services like that will use tools like our fingerprints to identify the false narratives, train the machines on what's false and what's not false, and try to limit the spread of false narratives by the machine. I think otherwise it's going to be a case of misinformation in, misinformation out.
Right.
And it'll make a crisis on the internet even more grave by having machines spreading misinformation at even greater scale and even more eloquently than many of the misinformation websites that we have rated.
Yeah, that's I hadn't quite considered the impact of an army of robots reading fake news, misinformation, and turning around and making more of it. That's bleak. So any other thoughts about where things are going? We'll start with other potentially scary things, and then we can move on to some optimism, perhaps.
Sure. I think so long as there is so much money in misinformation through programmatic advertising, that we're going to continue to see the growth in misinformation.
Right.
And it's across so many different topic domains. Healthcare being, again, the largest category. Even before COVID, there were websites, that claimed that 5G caused cancer. There are websites that claim that MMR vaccines cause autism.
Of course.
And measles had already come back in the US, UK, and some other markets before COVID because of all of this false reporting about the risks. So that problem remains as serious as it's been. It grows more serious as there's more and more money to be made in spreading the misinformation. Bad foreign actors, Russian disinformation, Chinese disinformation, for example. I think it's highly likely that they will be among the most adept users of services like ChatGPT. They can crank out a larger volume of somewhat different false narratives
Yeah.
as part of what they view as their information operations. It's really efforts to affect public opinion in the democracies in a divisive and unhelpful way for democracies. So
Right.
I think those are reasons to be somewhere between concerned and alarmed.
Okay.
Um, but I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel. I think it's only recently that the advertising community, for example, has realized just how much money is going to misinformation sites through programmatic advertising, that $2.6 billion amount
Yeah.
increasingly being stuck in people's heads. And responsible advertisers, are trying to do something about it. I think more and more of them will. It's kind of a minimally socially responsible thing to do, to not advertise on Russian disinformation sites and crazy healthcare hoax sites.
Minimal social responsibility is a good bar to
Yes,
put right
right.
on the ground and surpass.
I think it's low enough, and of course, it's absolutely in the self-interest of brands not to be associated with terrible websites, not to have their ads on the news story that said that Paul Pelosi was involved, with a gay prostitute. No,
Right.
that's not what happened. So I think as more and more CEOs worried about corporate reputation, CMOs who I think now increasingly realize that just because everybody has this problem is not an excuse for them to do nothing. I think more and more CMOs will look for solutions. There are easy solutions in the market.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science, even though so much of programmatic advertising is. There are supply side platforms that use our ratings to curate the websites where ads will appear. There are demand side platforms that similarly use our ratings. Not yet Google or the Trade Desk, which are the two biggest. That would make a tremendous difference, as would Facebook being more responsible in terms of where it's advertising.
Yeah.
But I think we're optimistic that we'll be able to protect an increasing percentage of programmatic advertising from appearing on misinformation websites, but there's an awfully long way to go.
It's interesting. I started my career in marketing in the first wave of the Great Recession, and at that point, what that downturn did was it moved advertisers into thinking about digital advertising, online advertising, because budgets were tight, because there was this idea you had a different kind of channel where you could be more efficient and you could only put your ad in front of people who are going to respond. I wonder if, potential forthcoming economic downturns or challenges may lead marketers to think we need to be in better places. We need to deploy these technologies, to improve, to make better use of our budgets, of our limited resources.
I think that's a great point. And the data on programmatic advertising being so much more cost effective,
Right.
both in terms of CPM and in terms of engagement on high quality sites versus misinformation sites. As advertisers and ad agencies look to wring out more efficiency from the spend, which is what likely will happen, as happened in earlier downturns, I hope they'll ask the question, can we spend less money and have a bigger bang for our buck by advertising on high quality sites and keeping our ads off of these terrible websites where they're really just wasted. Not just wasted, but actually diminish the brand. So
Yeah.
it should be a no-brainer. I think in an environment like this, that may make it likelier that CMOs and others will ask these kinds of questions. And as I mentioned earlier, there are brand safety experts at the big ad agencies who will make this point to brands and will encourage them to use exclusion lists to keep their ads off of terrible sites and inclusion lists to make sure that they're reaching people through high quality news and information sites as often as they can.
Yeah, I hope so as well. I hope that we can see that progress, that we can see that more informed and supportive ecosystem for news and advertisers alike. It's been really great talking with you, Gordon. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you so much to our audience for listening, for coming along as we move into this new season of News Take. Please subscribe to the podcast by searching for News Media Alliance News Take on your app of choice. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, as well as YouTube, and you can follow us on all of those sites so you don't miss an episode. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.